For decades, the United States government presented a simple story to the public. Drugs were an external threat. Cartels were the enemy. Law enforcement stood on one side, criminals on the other. But buried inside court transcripts, congressional testimony, and declassified files is a far more disturbing reality, one in which the lines between enforcement and criminal enterprise repeatedly collapsed. The pattern did not emerge all at once. It surfaced slowly, case by case, witness by witness, across different countries and different administrations. Each time the explanation was framed as an exception, a necessary compromise, a temporary arrangement in the service of a greater goal. And each time, the consequences were the same. During the Cold War, U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies became deeply embedded in Latin America's political conflicts. Anti-communism was the priority. Stability came second. Everything else was negotiable. Drug trafficking, once viewed as a criminal threat, began to be treated as a tolerable byproduct of larger geopolitical operations. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, this approach hardened into policy. Court records later showed that known drug traffickers were repeatedly granted protection in exchange for information, access, or cooperation. In some cases, traffickers were allowed to continue operating while rival organizations were dismantled. In others, entire smuggling networks were ignored because they were useful. The Drug Enforcement Administration was not immune to this logic. In multiple federal cases, judges acknowledged that informants tied to major cartels were permitted to move tons of narcotics while under U.S. protection. These were not low-level street dealers. They were logistics coordinators, pilots, financiers, and cartel enforcers. Their value was not measured by the drugs they moved, but by the enemies they helped eliminate. This strategy produced results on paper. Arrest statistics improved, seizures increased, press conferences were held, but beneath the surface the drug supply never declined. It shifted. Entire trafficking corridors were reshaped through selective enforcement. In Central America, traffickers aligned with U.S.-backed paramilitary groups moved cocaine with minimal interference. Congressional investigations later confirmed that U.S. agencies were repeatedly warned about this activity and chose not to act. The priority was not stopping drugs. It was winning proxy wars. One of the most documented examples emerged from the Iran-Contra investigations, where sworn testimony and internal memos revealed that drug flights linked to Contra supply operations were known to U.S. officials. The traffickers involved were not prosecuted at the time. Some were actively protected. The message was clear: cooperation bought immunity. In Mexico, the consequences were even more severe. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, U.S. agencies relied heavily on high-ranking cartel figures as informants. These relationships were often hidden from Mexican authorities, creating parallel power structures. Informants were shielded, while rival organizations were targeted, fueling cycles of violence that destabilized entire regions. The most infamous rupture came with the murder of DEA agent Enrique "Kiki" Camarena in 1985. Camarena had uncovered evidence linking powerful Mexican traffickers to protected intelligence assets. His investigation threatened to expose relationships that extended beyond cartel violence and into state corruption. He was kidnapped, tortured, and killed. Subsequent trials confirmed cartel responsibility, but allegations of deeper complicity never fully disappeared. Former agents later testified that critical evidence was buried, leads were shut down, witnesses were discouraged. The official narrative closed quickly, while unresolved questions remained. In later decades, the same strategy resurfaced under different names: cooperating sources, sensitive informants, operational necessity. In one federal case after another, Courts acknowledged that DEA informants were responsible for moving staggering quantities of drugs into the United States while receiving payments, legal protection, or both. Judges openly criticized the practice, noting that the government had effectively authorized criminal activity on a massive scale. One ruling described it as unacceptable conduct. Another called it government-sanctioned lawlessness. Yet the system persisted. Internal guidelines allowed informants to commit crimes with approval. Oversight was minimal. Accountability was rare. When operations collapsed or became public, responsibility dissolved into classified procedures and sealed records. The public was told the war on drugs was being fought. In reality, it was being managed. By the early 2000s, investigative journalists began connecting cases that had once seemed isolated. The same names appeared repeatedly, the same trafficking routes, the same pattern of protection followed by silence. What emerged was not a conspiracy, but a structure, one that rewarded results over ethics and secrecy over law. Drugs flowed, violence escalated, and the alliances continued. This was not failure. It was policy operating as designed. And the deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that some of the most powerful cartels in modern history did not survive despite U.S. enforcement strategies, but because of them. By the time the 21st century began, the pattern was no longer theoretical. It was written into federal court records. In case after case, defense attorneys began uncovering agreements between U.S. law enforcement and cartel-connected informants that went far beyond intelligence gathering. These were not passive relationships. They were operational partnerships, protected by secrecy and justified under internal guidelines never meant to be seen by the public. One of the clearest examples emerged in federal courtrooms in Chicago. In 2012, testimony revealed that a high-ranking member of the Sinaloa cartel had operated as a protected informant for years while coordinating the movement of massive quantities of cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine into the United States. According to sworn statements, the informant was allowed to continue trafficking as long as information flowed upward. The drugs were not intercepted. The routes were not disrupted. The profits were untouched. The court acknowledged the facts. Judges were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The government had knowingly permitted large-scale drug trafficking as part of an intelligence strategy. The informant's activities were not incidental. They were approved. This was not an isolated case. In New York, sealed filings later unsealed showed similar arrangements. DEA handlers authorized informants to participate in criminal conspiracies, launder money, and coordinate logistics, all under written exemptions. Internal approvals existed, but oversight was minimal and consequences non-existent. The legal framework enabling this behavior was known as authorized criminal activity. Under DEA policy, informants could be granted permission to commit crimes if those actions were deemed necessary to maintain credibility or gather intelligence. In practice, this meant traffickers could continue operating entire networks while shielded from prosecution. The scale of these permissions was rarely disclosed, even to prosecutors. In some cases, prosecutors themselves were kept in the dark. This secrecy fractured the justice system from within. Judges began questioning whether trials were even possible when key evidence was withheld under claims of national security. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were being prosecuted, while more powerful traffickers were protected by the same government bringing charges. They were not wrong. In 2015, a major investigation revealed that the DEA had secretly laundered money for cartels as part of undercover operations. Millions of dollars in drug proceeds were moved through U.S. financial systems with government approval. The stated goal was intelligence collection. The actual result was financial facilitation. Internal audits later confirmed that oversight of these operations was dangerously weak. Funds disappeared, records were incomplete, accountability was non-existent. The pattern extended beyond Mexico. In Colombia, informants tied to paramilitary groups involved in both drug trafficking and mass killings were used as intelligence assets. Congressional investigations later confirmed that U.S. agencies had continued cooperation despite documented human rights abuses. The drug trade financed violence, and violence stabilized territory. Both outcomes served strategic goals. In Honduras and Guatemala, similar relationships emerged. Traffickers aligned with political and military elites provided intelligence while moving cocaine northward. U.S. agencies were warned repeatedly by internal analysts that these alliances were empowering criminal states. The warnings were noted and ignored. The logic never changed. Short-term intelligence was prioritized over long-term consequences. Every protected informant destabilized rivals. Every destabilized rival triggered violence. Every spike in violence justified further intervention. The cycle fed itself. Inside the DEA, some agents objected. Whistleblowers later testified that informant control had collapsed. Handlers became dependent on the criminals they managed. Informants dictated terms, threatened to disappear, or manipulated intelligence to eliminate competitors. In effect, cartel leaders weaponized U.S. enforcement against their enemies. Court documents confirmed these fears. In multiple rulings, judges acknowledged that informants had provided selective information designed to benefit their own organizations. The DEA, reliant on these sources, failed to verify claims independently. Enforcement became asymmetric, brutal toward some groups, invisible toward others. The drug supply never diminished. It consolidated. The Sinaloa Cartel, repeatedly named in court filings as benefiting from protected informant relationships, expanded into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. Its growth coincided directly with periods of intense U.S. cooperation against rival cartels. This was not coincidence. By the late 2010s, investigative journalists began tracing overdose data alongside enforcement patterns. They found that heroin and synthetic opioid flows surged during periods when certain trafficking routes were effectively ignored. The human cost exploded while enforcement statistics remained politically convenient. Congress held hearings, reports were issued, promises were made. Nothing fundamental changed. Classified exemptions remained classified. Informant permissions remained secret. Oversight committees were briefed selectively. The public narrative stayed intact. Drugs were being fought, not managed. When agents crossed lines too visibly, they were disciplined quietly. When operations collapsed, files were sealed. When journalists asked questions, officials cited national security. The alliances were never framed as alliances. They were framed as tools. But tools have consequences. Communities across the United States absorbed the cost. Overdose deaths climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Entire regions hollowed out by addiction became statistical abstractions. Responsibility was diffused across agencies, administrations, and decades. No single decision caused the crisis. It was built through policy choices repeated over time, justified in secret, and defended in public. By the time declassified documents began surfacing through lawsuits and investigative reporting, the structure was already entrenched. The DEA was not an exception. It was one component of a broader enforcement philosophy that accepted collateral damage as unavoidable. The war on drugs had become something else entirely. Not a war to eliminate supply, but a system to control it. And as long as secrecy remained the shield, the partnerships remained invisible, even as their consequences became impossible to ignore. By the late 2010s, the consequences of decades of selective enforcement could no longer be contained within sealed files or courtroom footnotes. The United States entered the deadliest phase of the drug crisis in its history, driven not by plant-based narcotics, but by synthetic opioids whose distribution networks were far more centralized, efficient, and lethal. Fentanyl changed everything. Unlike cocaine or heroin, fentanyl did not require large cultivation zones or traditional smuggling hierarchies. It moved through chemical supply chains, pharmaceutical front companies, and tightly controlled cartel logistics. And those logistics were already in place, built, refined, and protected during years of informant-driven enforcement strategies. The same corridors once tolerated for intelligence purposes became superhighways for synthetic drugs. Internal DEA assessments later acknowledged that enforcement models designed around informant cooperation were ill-suited to disrupt fentanyl trafficking. The strategy depended on allowing certain actors to operate in order to gather intelligence on others. But fentanyl networks did not fragment the way older cartels had. They consolidated, and the informants who once provided leverage now controlled distribution at scale. In effect, the system had trained its own adversary. Court filings revealed that several individuals previously protected as cooperating sources reemerged as central figures in synthetic opioid distribution. Their earlier immunity agreements had expired, but the infrastructure they built remained intact. Routes were established. Corrupt contacts were secured. Money laundering mechanisms were normalized. The damage was already done. As overdose deaths surged, pressure mounted on federal agencies to explain how enforcement had failed so catastrophically. Public messaging focused on foreign sources, border security, and chemical precursors. Internally, however, reports painted a more complicated picture, one in which earlier policy choices had narrowed enforcement options. Aggressive prosecution of former informants carried risk. Trials could expose classified procedures. Discovery requests could reveal authorization memos. Witnesses could testify about crimes committed with government approval. Each prosecution risked unraveling years of covert practice. As a result, accountability stalled again. Congressional oversight committees requested briefings. Some were granted, others were delayed. Many records remained classified. When hearings were held, testimony was constrained by national security claims. The architecture of secrecy held. Whistleblowers attempted to force transparency. Former agents and analysts described a culture in which informant value eclipsed legal boundaries. Handlers were rewarded for intelligence yield, not harm reduction. Career advancement favored case numbers and seizures, metrics easily inflated through controlled operations that never threatened core supply chains. Those who challenged the system often found themselves isolated. Transfers followed, promotions stalled. Internal complaints disappeared into administrative processes that led nowhere. The message was subtle but consistent. Cooperation kept the machine running. Resistance endangered it. The judicial branch offered rare moments of clarity. In several rulings, judges openly criticized government conduct, stating that the authorization of criminal activity undermined the integrity of the justice system itself. One opinion warned that, when the state permits crime in pursuit of enforcement goals, it risks becoming indistinguishable from the organizations it claims to oppose. But rulings did not change policy. Each case was treated as exceptional. Each revelation was contained. Each scandal passed without structural reform. By the early 2020s, investigative reporters compiling decades of cases reached an unavoidable conclusion. The DEA cartel alliance was not a conspiracy, nor the product of rogue agents. It was a doctrine, informal, deniable, and deeply embedded. Its logic was simple. Total suppression was impossible, control was achievable, intelligence required access. Access required compromise, and compromise demanded silence. The human cost, meanwhile, was externalized. Communities devastated by addiction were discussed in statistics, not strategy meetings. Overdose deaths became background noise in policy debates dominated by geopolitical concerns. The people most affected were never part of the equation. The war on drugs had become an abstraction, not a moral campaign, not a public safety mission, but a managed conflict, calibrated to avoid disruption rather than eliminate harm. As declassified documents slowly surfaced through litigation and archival releases, they revealed continuity across administrations of different parties. The alliances persisted regardless of political rhetoric. Presidents changed. Policies evolved. The underlying practices remained. Secrecy was bipartisan. Impunity was institutional. The final irony was unavoidable. The same system that claimed to fight cartels had, at critical moments, ensured their survival. By choosing which organizations lived and which died, enforcement agencies reshaped the criminal landscape. Violence increased. Markets consolidated. The strongest groups endured. And when the public demanded answers, the truth was fragmented across redacted pages, sealed transcripts, and forgotten hearings. There was no single smoking gun, only a paper trail, one that showed how law enforcement, in its pursuit of control, crossed a line it never publicly acknowledged and never fully retreated from. The alliances were never announced. The permissions were never debated. The consequences were never owned. But they were real, and they are still unfolding.